Hi everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be talking about my most read authors. I'm not going to be talking about any authors that I read when I was a kid, so I'm not going to be talking about like Roald Dahl, Jacqueline Wilson, Lemony Snicket. I'm only going to be talking about writers that I have read as a grown-up, although that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be talking about kids' books. There are 11 authors that I'm going to talk about today, which seems like a bit of a weird number, you know, why wouldn't I just talk about 10? But there were 8 authors that I had read 6 books by, and I couldn't just get rid of one of them. And interestingly, I don't think this list really reflects my reading tastes. I mean, there's so many of my favourite authors that aren't on this list. The number of authors that I had read like 5 and 4 books by was quite extensive. I need to make sure that when I find like an author of colour that I absolutely love, I'm finding out like what is in their backlist. And I think most of the authors on this list are authors that do have a massive backlist who have been writing for quite a long time. And because they have written so many books, I've read like one of their books occasionally, but I don't feel like they're not someone who would stick out to me as an author that I absolutely love. But anyways, that's enough rambling from me. Let's get into my most read writers. I'm going to start with all of the authors that I've read 6 books from and work my way up to a writer that I have read 20 books from. And 3 of these writers I'm going to talk about kind of in tandem because I think I have the same kind of relationship with their writing in a way. So I have read 6 books by Margaret Atwood, and I think the order that I have read them in is The Handmaid's Tale, then The Heart Goes Last, then Stone Mattress, which is a collection of short stories, then The Testaments, then Hagseed, and then Alias Grace. So I really like Margaret Atwood's writing. I think I read The Handmaid's Tale in my second year of university, and I just remember I hadn't really read anything like it when I read it for the first time. I also read The Heart Goes Last when I was at university. I didn't study either of those books, but The Heart Goes Last was something that I incorporated into a critical commentary I did on a short story that I wrote. And the books I've read from her since haven't been like all-time favourites, but I have had a really great time reading them. I have thought that they were fantastic. I do think The Testaments was one of my favourite books in the year that I read it, and I do think it's a case of she has just written so many books. So if I'm reading like one a year from her, then it adds up, you know? She's not necessarily someone who I would consider an absolute favourite author, but I think, you know, maybe if I read a few more of her books, it's an interesting kind of balancing thing, isn't it? Like, who would be your favourite author? Someone who has written 3 books that you think are absolute 5 stars, or someone who you've read like 12 books from and you've given them all 3 to 4 stars, you know? I don't know. She is one of those writers that I kind of discovered as I was really getting into feminism and really getting into literary fiction. I thought I was massively into literary fiction when I was at university, which kind of goes away to explain the next 2 writers I'm going to talk about. And that is Jeanette Winterson. So I loved Jeanette Winterson when I was at university. I think if you asked like 20-year-old Leanne who her favourite author was, she could have quite possibly said Jeanette Winterson. The first one I read was Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, and then it's a bit of a blur which ones I read next. I think Written on the Body, then Stone Gods, then Wait. Any of those could be flipped around though, potentially. Then Sexing the Cherry, and then The Gap of Time. And I have just quite mixed feelings on her writing. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, I loved. Sexing the Cherry was one that I studied, and I loved studying it. I had just the best time. It was in like a postmodern literature module. This book is so strange, but I don't know what it was about it. I just really loved analysing it. And the other books I've read from her I feel quite mixed about. The Gap of Time I just didn't like. If I'm being honest, Frankenstein really doesn't interest me. I would be interested in reading her memoir, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, and I'm sure she's got like a couple more books that I would be interested in reading as well, but that kind of literary experimental writing isn't something that I'm as drawn to as I once was. Which leads me quite nicely into the next author that I want to talk about, and that is Ali Smith. So I read There But For The in my first year of university, and I studied it, and I didn't like it that much. So I don't know why I felt the need to read loads more Ali Smith. Actually, I do know why. It's because I thought like I needed to be this kind of literary reader. Like I needed to be reading this kind of abstract, really literary fiction, and I shouldn't have thought that, but I did. I then read Girl Meets Boy, and I read How to Be Both. I read Public Library and Other Stories, which I'm actually kind of reluctant, now that I think about it, to include, because that was like an anthology of short stories by lots of writers with like little essays. I also read Autumn, which was the first book in the seasonal quartet, and that fully put me off reading the next 3. And the only book that I've still kept is The Story of Antigone, which is like a Greek myth retelling, and it's really like nicely illustrated. I really I really enjoyed the reading experience of this one, I suppose because it wasn't trying to be super literary. I don't think I'll ever read an Annie Smith book again. I just feel like she's trying to be too clever for me. But it is interesting that she is one of my most read writers because I felt that pressure when I was studying. Another author that I was introduced to through studying them at university, but one that I absolutely love, is Jackie Kay. I think Jackie Kay is one of those writers where I would read anything that she writes, and I think that's quite interesting because she does write quite a broad mix of things. So the first thing I ever read from her was Trumpet, and this is possibly one of my favourite novels just of all time. This was the book that I studied at university, and I just thought it was so incredible, just on a level of being an enjoyable, interesting read. I read this in one sitting, but also delving into it and studying it was something that I just found so intellectually nourishing. Trumpet is actually her only novel. I think she's probably most well known for being a poet. I then went on to read The Adoption Papers, I read Fire, and I read Bantam. So they are all poetry collections, and I completely love her poetry. I love that she often writes in a Scots dialect when she's writing poetry. And I then read Red Dust Road, which is her memoir, and The Lamplighter, which is a play. She talks about identity in such a way that I just find it so interesting. I think she's really fascinating as a person. I think if you're looking to get into poetry, then she is an author that I would recommend. The way her memoir is written feels like it's fiction, it feels like it's a novel because it's just so well written, and it's not told linearly, which is the way that you would possibly expect a memoir to be written. It is woven together really, really well in a way that feels like you're almost reading a novel. I think Jackie Kay is the first author on this list where I would probably say, yes, she is one of my favourite authors. Another writer that I have read 6 books from is Jane Austen. I've only got 5 of them here. Now, I could be completely wrong here, but I think the order I've read these books in is Pride and Prejudice, then Persuasion, then Northanger Abbey, then Emma, then Mansfield Park. No, I don't think that's right. I think I read Sense and Sensibility before I read Mansfield Park. But either way, I've read all of her full finished novels. I think Pride and Prejudice is fine. People do full in-depth videos ranking their favourite Jane Austen books. I'm gonna level with you, I did not pay enough attention to any of them to do that. All I can tell you is that my favourite is Sense and Sensibility. I fucking love Sense and Sensibility. Oh, Sense and Sensibility is one of those books where the longer the gap I have between reading it, the more affection I have for it, because I'm just oh, this book was doing so many good things for me. And I know a lot of people say that Sense and Sensibility, you can see an immaturity in Jane Austen's writing, and you can see some of the ideas that she wanted to discuss but discussed better in Pride and Prejudice. I just read this at the right time. It was just, I picked this up on a bit of a whim. It was just the next classic book that I wanted to read. And because of the time that I read it, it just connected to me so much. Jane Austen's work as a whole is not something that I feel hugely passionate about, but I am glad that I've read all 6 of her novels. And there are 3 mostly young adult authors that I've also read 6 books from. I say mostly because all 3 of these authors have also written books for grown-ups, and one of those authors is John Green. I'm pretty sure the first John Green book I read was The Fault in Our Stars, and I absolutely loved it when I read it. I then followed that up by reading Looking for Alaska, which I loved. I completely devoured Looking for Alaska. I was obsessed with it. I thought it was incredible. I don't think if I was to reread either of these books, I would feel the same way. But they did exactly what they set out to do when I read them. These were 2 of the books that got me back into reading after not reading for quite a few years. I then read Paper Towns and An Abundance of Catherines, and I didn't particularly care for either of those books. I remember having a great time reading Let It Snow, which, again, maybe John Green shouldn't have made this list because he didn't write this novel entirely himself. So there's 3 interconnected short stories in here from 3 different YA writers, but I'm including it anyway. And then I read Will Grayson, which I liked. So 2 of John Green's books I didn't like, 2 of them I thought they were a good time, and 2 of them I adored them when I read them. And I don't have particularly strong opinions beyond that. I think there was a time, and possibly we're still in that time, where it was cool and edgy to hate John Green. I think maybe it's just seen as cool and edgy to shit on things that teenage girls like, and a lot of internalized misogyny led to teenage girls shitting on things that teenage girls liked. I'm not sure if I'll ever read another John Green book. His new non-fiction book isn't something that I'm particularly interested in, but I think if he maybe wrote a fiction novel for adults, I would definitely be interested to read that. I think he's a good, in fact, a great writer. But any writer who has quite a broad range of work, there's going to be some that you like and some that you don't like. And I definitely have mixed feelings about the next writer on this list as well, which is Sarah Crossan. The first Sarah Crossan book I read was One, and this is a novel that is told in verse about conjoined twins, and I think this is Sarah Crossan's best book. I have read 5 of her other novels, and none of them I have loved as much as this one. I have since read The Weight of Water, I have read Moonrise, and both of those I thought were fine. I read We Come Apart, which I really did not like. I read her novel for adult readers, which is also told in verse. Here is the Beehive, and I didn't like that, but just for like very personal reasons. It had nothing to do with the writing or anything. And then fairly recently I read Toffee, which is another one of her YA books, and that was the closest that I had come to like loving one of her books since reading one. But because her novels are written in verse, they are like very quick to get through, so I think they are something that I have thought to like pick up when I was looking for something like really short. And because she has written so many, again, there's just a real breadth of work to choose from, and I think because of that she is someone whose work I will just continue to read. I think particularly if she writes more novels intended for a grown-up audience, I would be really intrigued to read another one of those that are about like a subject that I don't have such strong personal feelings about. The next writer on this list is one that I would definitely consider one of my favourite writers, and that is Holly Bourne. The first Holly Bourne book I read was The Manifesto on How to Be Interesting. I then read Am I Normal Yet and What's a Girl Gotta Do. I didn't own these books for ages because they were books that I had read digitally, but the wonderful Victoria over at What Victoria Read recently gifted me these two, as well as the third book in the trilogy, which I haven't read yet, What's a Girl Gotta Do. I then read It Only Happens in the Movies, another young adult novel. I read her adult fiction debut, How Do You Like Me Now, which again, really enjoyed this one. And returning to her young adult novels, I read Are We All Lemmings and Snowflakes very recently, and it was probably the easiest 5 stars I've given this year. All of her books deal with like themes of feminism and gender equality, and particularly about mental health as well. I think when it comes to her young adult novels, she knows her intended audience so well, like she knows teenagers so well. All of the characters that she writes across her young adult fiction and her adult fiction feel so authentic and honest to me. Again, she's an author that just has so many books. Like there are so many books of hers that I have yet to read. I've heard mixed things about Soulmates, which I think was her first novel, but as I said, I've got What's a Girl Gotta Do already on my shelf, waiting for me to read it. She's got another book that is called like All of the Places I've Cried or something. She's got another adult novel called Pretending, which I really want to read, and her latest novel is called The Yearbook or The Classmates or something, and I really want to read that. She's probably got more books as well that I haven't thought of. This next writer was one that I wasn't sure if I was going to include or not, but I have read 7 of their books, and that is Holly Smale, who is probably most well known for writing the Geek Girl series. And that is the exact reason that she's on this list, because I have read the entirety of that series. I'm pretty sure I binged these books. I couldn't tell you anything about the plots of any of them. I know that there's like this really geeky girl who is really interested in like facts and numbers, who is like scouted for a modelling agency, and her like entering into that world is like the plot of the whole series. But I just remember them being really fun and really easy, light reading. I think I listened to them with a mix of reading them physically and listening to them on audio. I think I listened to a lot of them when I was working in retail and spending a lot of time like rearranging a stock room, which was like a mammoth task. And those books were just like really breezy listening for me to like get through this monotonous, boring task. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about Holly Smale or about the Geek Girl series, but she is one of my most read authors. Jumping from 7 to 9 books, the next author on this list was another kids writer that I came to as an adult reader, and that is Judy Blume. I could not tell you the order that I've read these books in, but I have read Dee Dee. I have read Here's to You, Rachel Robinson. I've read Then Again, Maybe I Won't. I've read Blubber. I've read Iggy's House. I've read It's Not the End of the World. I've read Just as Long as We're Together. I'm gonna put these ones down now. And then I think possibly her most famous two, I would say, are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and Forever. Forever was my favorite book for younger readers last year. It's a young adult novel, and I think you can see so much of the origins of the YA genre in this book. And I think that's really what I've got out of Judy Blume's book. It's like they have been enjoyable reads and I have like had a good time reading them, but it's also really interesting to see writing for kids from those decades. What is it that kids were concerned about when Judy Blume was writing? I found them like really interesting looking at them from that perspective, and I will definitely continue to read more of her books. I do have time categorize on my TBR already, but I'm sure she has written lots more books that I will eventually get around to reading. I do kind of wish I had read them like when I was the target audience, like when I was like the age that they're meant to be read at, but nonetheless I have thought they were absolutely fantastic. And the writer that I have read the most books from by quite a significant way is a poet. I don't think this is going to come to any surprise to anyone, but the writer that I have read the most from is Ann Duffy. I have read 20 of her books. I could not tell you the order that I read them in. I know the first one that I read was The World's Wife, which I think is where a lot of people start with Ann's poetry, but I am going to whiz through the titles of all of them just for the sake of being thorough. So I've read The Other Country, I have read Meantime, Feminine Gospels, Rapture, I have read a collection of her love poems, The Bees, this one is signed and dedicated to me, Standing Female Nude, Selling Manhattan, Sincerity, and then onto her Christmas books. Now they're very short, but I have read them all, so therefore they are part of the list. So, Mrs. Scrooge, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, The Christmas Truce, I think this one is possibly my favourite of them, Wenceslas, Bethlehem, Dorothy Wordsworth's Christmas Birthday, The King of Christmas, The Wren Boys, Pablo Picasso's Noel, and The Frost Fair. And she is another one of those writers that I discovered at university and have continued to read, and I will continue to read. I will read everything that she writes. And there are definitely like collections of hers that I have loved more than others, that have impacted me more than others. But overall, just looking at the body of her work, I adore her writing and it means so much to me. I remember in my first year of university, I had to do a writing poetry module and I had no interest in this module. I had never written poetry before. I didn't know how. I didn't think it was something that interested me. And then I read Ann Duffy and it was like a switch just flicked in my head and I was like, oh, this is brilliant. And every time I would read a collection of hers, I would just have this like flurry of inspiration. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wouldn't have written if it wasn't for her. So she's just such a huge inspiration for me. So there we have it. They are all of my most read writers. I would love to know who your most read writer is. Are there any of the authors that I've spoken about today that you've read a lot from as well? Any thoughts that you have, I would love to have a chat with you down in the comments. And if you don't have anything particular to say, just leave me one of your favorite emojis so I know that you're here. Normally I would say all of the books that I've mentioned will be linked down below in the description. They won't be. There's too many books. Anyways, that's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you guys are doing well and I will speak to you in my next video.